Welcome to the Bald Ambition Podcast. I'm your bald host, Mookie Spitz. And the one with ambition today is Mr. Dale Cooke. He is president of Philly Cooke Consulting and FDA Ad Law. I had you on in May. A lot has happened in only a few months. And welcome back, Dale. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Great seeing you, Spitz, and happy to be back.
A Chinese blessing, an oft quoted one, is, "May you live in interesting times." And it's actually a curse, and a cynical, clever one in that, because folks want stability, they want security. Business planners, business leaders, especially in healthcare, want consistency and assurance to make decisions that are in the interests of public health and also compliant from a legal and regulatory framework. And as the Yoda of compliance in our industry for healthcare communications, how do you feel about these interesting times? And what kind of recommendations can you give our listeners right off the top to provide them a little bit more assurance when the headlines are exploding with the CDC being restructured, with our health and wellness almost at its core being questioned and reevaluated?
Yeah, there's no doubt that working with industry as I do, what industry cares about is knowing what the rules are and then ensuring they comply with those rules. And with regard to healthcare communications, every indication at this moment is that there has not been any actual change in those rules. Now, having said that, what's the basis for that? Well, the basis for that is that this year, so far, we've gotten 5 enforcement actions taken by the FDA with regard to promotional communications on behalf of prescription drug manufacturers. Looking at those enforcement actions, it's very clear that these were initiated before things were shaken up at the FDA. The communications in question, in some cases, were made last year or even before, so it just probably took several months, and with the chaos that was intentionally inflicted upon the FDA, probably delayed even longer before those things were publicized and put out to the public. And so those enforcement actions, though, did come out, and they were very much in keeping with what you would have expected. Again, they were probably initiated under the previous administration, and this administration so far has just continued. Now, there's been a whole lot of Sturm und Drang, right? Sound and fury signifying nothing, coming out of the commissioner and the HHS secretary about what they're going to do to prescription drug manufacturers and marketers. But so far, that has signified nothing. There has actually been no change. And so for now, we're able to assume that the same rules apply until, we get an indication otherwise. In other areas, there has been pretty significant shakeup. You alluded to, what's happened with the CDC. And as we're recording this, we're just a short time removed from a gunman going to the CDC, attempting to have a mass shooting of its employees. That attack was undoubtedly, generated in an atmosphere of distrust of the CDC, and that distrust was fostered by many of the people who are currently in this administration, who spent years telling us that the CDC couldn't be trusted and that their messages were, we're putting people's children at risk. When, of course, the reality is exactly the opposite. Officials at the CDC, these government employees have dedicated their lives to the public health, and they have done so, and in most cases, if not all of them, at a significant personal sacrifice. They're earning less money because they're working for the government. They're doing it because they're dedicated to the public health. And those, government employees, civil servants who've dedicated themselves to keeping you and your family safe have been vilified for years by the HHS secretary and others in this administration. It's I find it ironic that the signal success of the first Trump administration, to my mind, the greatest thing that the first Trump administration did was executing the development of safe, effective COVID vaccines in record time. I mean, what they accomplished in less than a year of producing safe and effective vaccines that are outrageously effective, much more effective than you had any right to expect in advance of their development, was absolutely groundbreaking. And now the HHS secretary is going out and lying about those same products and saying that in fact they never worked, and thereby the Secretary Kennedy is, lying and denigrating, what was, to my mind, the single greatest accomplishment of the first Trump administration. And it's truly astonishing to see that happen. And people in our world who deal with these, concerns about, communicating about prescription drugs, vaccines, etc., we're all shocked and appalled by what just happened. I don't know about you. I haven't yet gotten my COVID boosters. They're not yet available here. I certainly am planning on it if I'm able to get it. I don't actually know, because of the new restrictions that this administration has placed, on whether I will even be able to get a COVID booster this fall. That's absurd. This is supposed to be an administration that's about choice, and they're taking away my choices. They're limiting my rights to have access to safe and effective vaccines.
Access is one thing, and then managed care coverage is another form of control. And to your point, Operation Warp Speed was arguably the most successful initiative Trump launched. And from a scientific research point of view, absolutely paradigm bending. And as you say, the mRNA backbone of that treatment, of which $500 million for further research, has also been rescinded. So we live in truly interesting times.
Yeah.
For a moment, though, allow me to put a pin in the first few things that you said, because I know a lot of listeners to this podcast, based on feedback I received on our May show, wanted to thank you for the assurance you provided at that time. And it sounds like you're reiterating that assurance that if you are a healthcare marketer, given everything that we have done before and everything that you've recommended in terms of maintaining compliance within our industry, essentially the train is still on the tracks. The message that you're giving our listeners, at whatever level they're at or role within the healthcare communications industry, is keep doing what you're doing, same rules apply, but we need to wait and see what happens. Is that more or less correct? Just to let folks know that the essence hasn't changed, even if we feel like the rug has been pulled out from beneath us in terms of public health.
For now, that's absolutely the message. And I caveat it because we have seen significant changes at FDA's OPDP, the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion. And, we have not yet seen the people who are newly in place do things or say things to notify us of a change that could alter at a moment's notice. The interesting times that you're talking about, before we got hopped on this, we were talking about something that happened either early this morning or late last night. It is a fire hose of updates and changes, and separating out from all of that the things that really matter is essential. And for now, the things that really matter have not changed.
Well, that's good to note, with the caveat that people were thanking you for not being Chicken Little. The sky is not falling in public health. But what you seem to be intimating is that status quo seems to be roiling already. To your point, Trump made a post that companies themselves apparently need to be accountable for misinformation related to their own vaccine data, which is on its face astonishing, and I believe exemplifies the core of the issue here, which is doubting years and years of data, calling into question clinical trial methodology and protocols, reevaluating the very paradigm of immunology and science. What can we make of this from public health? You and I are communicators. You've assured folks, as the Yoda of our industry, how to stay within their swim lanes for legality and compliance. And I've been working on the communication side to assure that the messages that the healthcare companies resonate with their target audiences. How do we operate in an environment where both of these sides of the equation are being nullified?
The data is there, and it absolutely has been presented truthfully and fully by the manufacturers. The public hearings, for us, these advisory committee hearings are run-of-the-mill business as usual. You advise your clients on how they're going to handle the advisory committee meetings, and for a typical product, 30-40 people would log in around the country to sort of see what's going on with that specific product. Most of those people are investors who want to try to get a read on whether the stock for that company is going to go up and down. For the initial COVID vaccine, and if I remember correctly, the first public hearing was for the Pfizer Comirnaty vaccine. It wasn't named that at the time. It didn't have that name yet. But there were something like 2 million people who logged into YouTube to watch those hearings and who saw all of the data being publicly presented, demonstrating the amazing efficacy of this product and showing that, and then we had the same hearings later for the Moderna vaccine. And that vaccine also publicly presented, showing the data that demonstrated it is incredibly safe and effective. Now, that does not mean that absolutely no one experienced any side effects. Of course, people always experience side effects. But when you're looking at, the safety and efficacy of vaccines, you always look at it from that overarching public health perspective. They must be overwhelmingly safe, and they must be overwhelmingly safe precisely because we are administering vaccines to healthy people. And so you don't want to put people at risk. And so the Trump administration was the administration that was initially responsible for the, sponsoring the development of these vaccines. It was the Trump administration's FDA that approved these vaccines, and they are in fact safe and effective. So, that what we have to get better at as an industry is figuring out how to deal with misinformation across the board, And we really need to figure out how to deal with the misinformation when it's coming from the HHS secretary. That's a challenge we've never faced before. That's something new. It is deeply concerning. Uh, I don't think industry is currently in a place where it knows how to deal with this. And certainly, if you're a company that is working in this space, you can't think that future development plans can be unaltered, right? I was joking with a friend the other day that every single researcher working in this space was opening up their emails after they heard Kennedy cutting off all of these grants for research, and looking at relocating to Australia, relocating to the UK, relocating to any other country in the world, which was undoubtedly throwing money at them and offering them wonderful labs, because that would be the place to go. If the United States is not going to welcome cutting edge research that improves lives, the researchers are still going to do the work. They're just going to do the work in other countries. Um, so I'm not sure how we as an industry can do that. I do think that that's the challenge we're facing. Um,
Yeah, the jitters are across the board. Just as there's been meddling, we could call it that, in the steel industry, in the rare earth industry, in the semiconductor chip industry, with the US government now taking a stake in companies. There's been executive orders and mandates within the pharmaceutical industry as well, with suggestions made of forcing pharmaceutical companies to manufacture here or endure incredibly stiff tariffs. And Trump himself has mentioned 150%, 200% tariffs on imported medicines.
I'm not sure exactly how a 150% tariff would reduce drug prices. That's allegedly one of the biggest things that we want to do. I don't see how you can double their price and then say that you're tackling that issue of lowering drug prices.
Yeah, well, to your point, the overarching strategy ostensibly has been to maintain and enhance American hegemony throughout the world in terms of shifting manufacturing base and focus of power. But then you had the leaders of China and Russia and India doing a big bear hug just this week, pretty much in reaction to some of the tariffing that you mentioned. So there is a counterintuitive whiplash effect that's going on for anyone looking at this overarching situation. But getting back to what we're talking about here, it's that same kind of Orwellian twisted logic, which is now at the center of the NIH, the CDC, and what are we to make of it, and how can we assure but at the same time perhaps warn our own constituents that this is really just the beginning of something that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, you and I, in our history of tackling misinformation, I don't know how many of your listeners are aware of our involvement in a campaign during the pandemic itself to try to combat misinformation. And, we partnered with some friends to try to get the word out and do what we could back then. It feels like we were so naive. Going into that 5 years ago, we thought, oh well, we're definitely going to have to be concerned about minority groups and rural Americans, and we never for a moment, at least certainly not in my head, thought that there was this political divide that would be one of the primary obstacles to combating misinformation. Because going back historically, there have been just as many wackos on the left as on the right who were, feeding misinformation about the safety of vaccines. That is unfortunately no longer true. It's become more popular on one side of the political divide. Um, but when we were doing that back then, when we were trying to combat the misinformation, we've always known that the single best way to combat medical misinformation is to get good information in the hands of healthcare professionals. That, yeah, your Uncle Joe, your Aunt Jolene, whoever, might be willing to listen to the podcast from the alleged expert who will show you that sunshine will cure prostate cancer. But when that person is confronted with a nurse, a physician, a nurse practitioner, a pharmacist who is saying to them, no, this is going to keep you safe. Let me explain to you why this is going to keep you safe. That the information coming from a trusted healthcare professional is the single best means of combating misinformation. That has been borne out in research countless times. And so for members of industry who are concerned about the fact that this administration is now lying about the products that they manufacture, the primary thing has to be go back to basics, go back to those core insights, get good information in the hands of the trusted healthcare professionals who will actually be advising patients. Now, what do you do about the patients who refuse to go see a healthcare professional because they believe the lies that have been spewed out? Yeah, that's a more challenging situation. I know that a lot of healthcare professionals have joined in, these efforts. I'm assuming you're well aware, and though maybe some of your listeners are not, about the group known as Shots Heard Round the World, and that group of pediatricians and other physicians who have been pushing back on this long before the COVID vaccines came into anybody's memory or into anybody's foresight. There was this group of physicians who were out there who were saying, we need to take a stand, we need to get good information out there. And more often now, you're seeing physicians, especially, taking to TikTok, taking to YouTube Shorts, Instagram, etc., to put out good information. It's hard. It's really hard to find good information in the sea that's out there. I don't mean to downplay the work that's involved, but I think our job in industry is put more of that good information out there, get it into the hands of the trusted messengers, knowing that, anything that we ourselves say is not as likely to be trusted. But if I get the information to the nurse who's in the room with the patient, or even that nurse who is on TikTok, doing a little song and dance video, if that person has good information, then it's more likely to be trusted.
Part of the challenge is it's not only what's being said, but how it's being said and by whom. And you brought up the initiative for public service that we were involved with during the pandemic. And there was an HCP component to it as well, which we deemed, to your exact point, equally significant for all the great reasons that you cite. And as you mentioned, anti-vaxism was the purview of yoga instructors and nutritionists, usually on the left side of the political spectrum, often the extreme left side. It was hippie stuff, anti-vaxxing. And that pendulum has radically swung over to the right, ostensibly because it's an opportunistic political wedge issue. There's recognition that the growing anti-vax movement has reached a critical mass sufficient for getting votes. And I know that that sounds like crass opportunism, but that is de facto politics. So the shame here and the sadness, at least from my point of view as a healthcare marketer, is how entrenched institutions might have dropped the ball to a certain extent in terms of highlighting some of the negative aspects of what's ostensibly and statistically a beneficial regimen. So you're always going to have adverse events. You're always going to have side effects. There's always risk. And the American public, not to speak for the American public, but there are millions of folks out there who felt deceived and manipulated by the very institutions that are now being routed. And whether or not this is crass, opportunistic propaganda, and whether or not it's rooted in actual communication failings is debatable. But it's very, very clear that the message hasn't gotten across in a way that's been sufficiently convincing to millions of Americans who've thought otherwise and who have, we do live in a democracy, voted in an individual who was fairly transparent about his mandate, inclusive of short-circuiting the very initiative that you cited as the hallmark of his prior administration. There's been an anti-vax tinge to Trump's statements going back for years as a reflection of this skepticism. So how can we do better, Dale, as an industry to thwart some of this misinformation that goes beyond merely communicating better with healthcare professionals? What do you think we might have done wrong, and how could we get better? I know that it's not in your wheelhouse for ensuring compliance, but we've got the microphone now to perhaps do some good or at least alert folks that there's a crisis. And at the same time, there's an opportunity to put the mirror up to our own faces, that when we do get another go at this, we can do a better job of communicating with emotionally resonant messages to an American public who is, by all fairness, scientifically illiterate. Most folks don't get it, and it shows, and we're all paying the price.
Yeah, I think the final message that you ended on about how we're all paying the price has not fully come through. That these decisions about, for example, getting vaccinated, getting your child vaccinated, are, communal decisions. Yeah, there are individual rights involved, but when we come to vaccination, the individual gets protection from being vaccinated, but the community gets protected when a sufficient number of individuals are vaccinated. And so for a lot of these vaccines, we need, vaccination rates above 95%, right, of the population that needs to be vaccinated for all of us to be protected. And so, there is always an American instinct to think first of the individual and to only think of the community later. But I would, remind everyone that when we talk about mandates to, prevent disease, this is as American as it gets, right? George Washington in the Revolutionary War required his soldiers to undergo, it wasn't vaccination, it was variolation. It was the predecessor technology. Far, far, far more dangerous, by the way, than today's vaccines. And he required his army to undergo it because he knew that smallpox could absolutely decimate the American forces, and there would not be a United States had George Washington not done that. So, thinking of the community and thinking of, your role as an American, and making sure that your child is safe, making sure that your neighbor's child is safe, making sure that all of us are safe, and engaging in that as a communal effort. I don't think that message has been as prevalent. I think we have focused primarily on benefits and risks to the individual. And will that message resonate? I don't know, not my job. But it certainly is one that's not out there.
I think that there's a secondary problem that feeds into this lack of altruism and selfishness. And that is the perspective of, if I could go there for just a second, vitalism. It was a scientific paradigm prevalent in the 18th and into the 19th century. You could chat GPT it, Google it. And the essential tenet of this model was that the human body's own immune system is sufficient and necessary to ward off all disease. And as an ancillary to that, any kind of intervention, specifically vaccines, actually weaken not only the human body, but the entire species in their ability to sufficiently respond to these contagions. Now, this idea has been repeatedly disproven and dismissed and become orthodoxy. The reason I bring this up is just to give listeners context, and I'm not blaming the victim here or assigning any kind of credulity to the philosophy of science of RFK Jr. But if you've listened to this guy over the decades, this is his foundational belief. There was a news story only a couple months ago that he was bathing with his family in a polluted reservoir in Pennsylvania, I believe. And this fits that mentality that I can toughen myself up through exercise and eating well. And vaccines and any kind of intervention is actually detrimental not only to my body, but to the human race. And again, I'm reiterating this nonsense simply to give this movement perspective. And I think it behooves us as communicators and advocates of public health to not simply dismiss what we consider the ranting of conspiratorial maniacs and contextualize it within the history of science, no matter how flawed and disproven, and also come to understand that these conspiracy theories run deep and they're elaborate. And in that depth are particularly manipulative for vulnerable populations who don't know better.
Yeah, we don't use leeches to try to cure disease. We don't engage in serious discussions about wacko theories of how the immune system works. Life expectancy is incredibly improved in the 20th and 21st centuries, and it was incredibly improved after the development of vaccines. Mitch McConnell is still walking around and is a living embodiment to a certain extent of the consequences of polio. These are not things that could not happen again. These are things that absolutely did happen, that happened not that long ago, and that we can prevent. Children are, more than 100 people wound up in the hospital in that Texas measles outbreak. I believe 2 people died. The last time I saw a report, every single one of the people who was in the hospital and the 2 people who died was unvaccinated. We can eradicate measles, but only if we do so vigilantly every year. You and I are talking now right at the beginning of the school year in early September. and children need to be vaccinated before they go into the classroom. And all of the data is showing that these theories that are out there are convincing people not to have their child vaccinated, and the vaccination rates are going down. That is a danger not just to those individual children whose health is being put at risk, but also to the community as a whole. And so we need to treat this as, a communal response, in addition to, pointing out that just because RFK Jr. has been confirmed by the Senate, that does not mean that he is speaking the truth. He is willing to lie. He has spent decades of his career lying. And I met RFK Jr. long, long time ago. And he was an incredibly well-respected environmental lawyer back then. This was before half his brain was eaten by a worm, and also, before he went off on this anti-vaccine crusade. Exactly what happened, whether it was the worm that is responsible for this, or whether it was convictions related to, outdated science, I'm not going to go to my astrologer to try to prevent measles, or to ask them how to cure my dermatitis. And I'm not going to trust people who, want to put the leeches on me either. And as for swimming in raw sewage, I will respectfully suggest that none of your listeners should do so. I would encourage all of them to avoid exposure to raw sewage. Please do not do that. And the fact that, a government official is doing so and is proudly declaring the fact that he's an idiot should not make any of us alter our decisions.
I am obviously aligned and entertained by all your points. The challenge, though, is I think folks who have decided for whatever reason that they are an 18th century vitalist would consider your pontification more of the orthodoxy and an expression of the propaganda of the deep state.
Well, so let's be clear. The orthodoxy that I am espousing is the orthodoxy that is responsible for the incredible lengthening of the human lifespan. The orthodoxy that is responsible for the amazing reductions in childhood infant deaths, right? That, if you want your children to live, grow up, eventually have children of their own, etc., follow this orthodoxy. It works. We know it works.
No disagreement from this bald host on this podcast and your former collaborator in educating the public on the benefits of vaccines. A quick Google or chatty search will reveal 154 million lives saved estimate since only 1974. And vaccines in and of themselves have been the most beneficial medical procedure aside from clean drinking water. These are facts. So,
and yet again, remember, avoid raw sewage. Clean drinking water, incredibly important.
this goes full circle. So we spend billions on treatments for ailments ranging from oncology to autoimmune problems. And vaccines, here's another irony. Vaccines, as far as the profitability and revenue of the big pharmas, is low. I worked on vaccine portfolios, and it was tough to get budget because the profitability is not high and the logistical hassle is a nightmare. So even if you're looking at big, bad, plutocratic pharma, vaccines are not the profit center for the industry, and they tend to be a big pain. So all of this begs the question of the mess that we're in. And I appreciate you coming on to just spread the word that vaccines are not only safe, but they're efficacious, that we, the American people, are being manipulated by what could be construed as 18th century, air quote, science with its own opportunistic agenda, that we should listen to our doctor regarding our own personal health. And as healthcare communicators, going back to the beginning of this conversation, we should keep doing what we're doing regarding the compliance and the regulatory environment. You've recently written an excellent summation of the current situation with specific recommendations. I'm going to put the link in the podcast description of your excellent update for folks in our industry. And what next? What could we, should we do? And if you could rub your Cooke crystal ball with your cheesesteak greasy hands.
That metaphor, Spitz, went way off the rails. But yeah, no, my crystal ball is incredibly cloudy. I readily admit that because of how things are going, finding reliable, good sources and keeping on top of these developments is the best thing for industry. You mentioned about the FDA, the Thompson FDA weekly roundup piece that I wrote. And that's a reliable outlet. Stat News is a reliable outlet. There are sources that are out there that people need to go back to. Now more than ever, it is absolutely essential to find reliable sources of information and to make sure that you stay on top of developments because things are happening so rapidly. Uh, you know, so my crystal ball, you know, ask me again in a few weeks and I'll tell you what happened in the last few weeks, and that's about the extent of what I'll be able to do. It's all my crystal ball works more like a rear view mirror. In terms of the things that people in industry can do, remember why you're here, right? You're in industry presumably not because it's an incredibly lucrative way to pad your nest egg. You're here presumably because you care about improving patients' lives and outcomes. You care about that parent who is worried about their child at 3 a.m. And you want to make sure that people are leading safer, healthier lives and having better outcomes. And if that's your true North Star and you use that as your guiding post, then you're less likely to be led astray.
And I think that's a terrific way to cap it, which is follow your heart. What got us here in healthcare communications is exactly that: improving public health, extending and improving human life. And if we can keep doing what we're doing, we can help ensure, hopefully, that continues to happen. I'd love to have you back in a few months.
Spitz, we can talk again and I can explain why everything that I just said is wrong because things will have changed so radically.
RFK is up on the Hill this week, and he's going to have to explain his rationale for canning 20% of the CDC, including its executive management. There was recently an open letter from 9 former directors of the CDC saying what you've been saying, which is it's crazy time in DC. So let's keep our fingers crossed that kids can get the vaccinations that they and our entire society needs, and that we retain access and managed care for the vaccines that have been proven efficacious since Mitch McConnell almost succumbed to paralysis. There you go. Thanks so much, Dale. Really appreciate it. And thank you for listening to the Bald Ambition podcast. Like, comment, share. This is a very important public service announcement from our very own Yoda of healthcare communication, none other than Dale Cooke. We'd love to hear back from you and talk again soon. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you, Spitz.